Something we often overlook as part of a project is all of the homework that comes along with it. I don't see very many people showing this subject when it comes to YouTubers. Some people will reference to it, make comments about work that had to be done off camera, various different boring bits that nobody wants to film. And yes, it is difficult to film somebody sitting there staring at a screen for hours on end. The reality is, this is an easy to overlook aspect of any build. You will have gaps of information that you will need to fill. You will have schematics you'll have to find. You're going to have all kinds of pinouts and documentation you're going to have to dig up off the internet or out of factory service manuals or third-party manuals like Chilton's or Haynes. As we get into the wiring part of this project, I definitely didn't have everything I was going to need, and I knew that. But I needed to go online and find all the information I could before I go out and start de-pinning everything or pulling apart the loom. And while I'm not certain I'm going to be able to show you much more than any other YouTuber out there as far as the homework goes, I wanted to at least cover some ideas around what all I needed to find. I am running a K24 A2 out of a TSX, but not that intake manifold and not that throttle body. I'll be running an AP1 S2000 intake along with a AP1 transmission. That means I need to use the VSS, the vehicle speed sensor, out of an S2000 transmission, not a TSX transmission. That means I need to have the intake air control valve or idle control valve out of an S2000. There is none in a TSX. TSX are drive-by-wire throttle bodies. Early AP1 or early S2000 intakes are cable throttle, not drive-by-wire. Later S2000s switched to drive-by-wire. I also needed the information on the ignition coils, as far as which wire is which. I needed information on the coolant sensor location and wiring, the intake air temperature location wiring. I'm not even certain I'm going to use those sensors. I might utilize my own, but knowing where they are on the factory harness was absolutely required. I needed to know exactly how the wiring was done for the camshaft sensors, the crankshaft sensor, the VTC solenoid, the VTEC switch solenoid. All of these various different plugs go somewhere and have some type of requirement. A lot of two wires might not be polarity specific, but it's still good to have that information on hand. And having the colors also helps you confirm that the plug you're looking at is the plug you think it is when you go to unravel everything. My next step on this topic in the build is going out there and actually doing work, but without having this information, that work is blind. Don't ignore this aspect of doing the homework when you think about what it's going to take to do a project. You're going to have homework that needs to be done. Don't ignore it. Make sure to allocate time for it. Make sure to think about it. Make sure to plan for it. And don't get discouraged because you have homework that needs to get done. Don't be discouraged that there's research that you don't know how to find yet. In some cases, this might mean learning how to identify how something is designed or wired, regardless of make, model, manufacturer. It might look like learning how to identify the pins on a TPS, regardless of where they come from. In a lot of cases, you can use generic sensors for all of these things that run an engine. You can switch out coils, you can switch out injectors, you can switch out a TPS, air temperature sensors, coolant sensors. You can use generic idle air control valves. All kinds of things don't have to be make, model specific. So don't be afraid to do your homework and find out if you want to customize your application for your needs. One of the aspects of any build that will be very specific to an engine, though, is going to be the position triggering. How do you tell how fast the engine's running and where is it at in its operation cycle? You can set up a custom crank sensor on a lot of older vehicles. That'd be highly recommended. You can always use a distributor off of a factory car, but the problem with a factory distributor is it's going to have some type of lash from the gear interface that it is driven off the crank. When you're under load, that isn't necessarily a problem for the spark system, but when you're trying to know exactly where an engine's at, its constant acceleration and deceleration can end up causing noise in your signal, so to speak. So retrofitting a crank trigger system is not always a bad idea, but if your factory car has one, you would be well advised to figure out how to use it if you can. Same thing with your camshaft sync. If you want to run full sequential and not waste the spark ignition, you're going to need to have some type of a cam sync. So using your factory cam trigger would be well advised as well, which means you need to know how it runs and operates. Is it a variable reluctor sensor or is it a Hall effect sensor? When that also changes whether or not the pinout matters. If it's variable reluctance, it probably doesn't matter. It's probably non-polarity specific, whereas a Hall effect sensor will be. Also, all of these inputs and outputs are going to have their own ground and positive voltage requirements. A lot of sensors are going to run on a 5-volt reference signal, but you're also going to have things that run off of a 12-volt signal. For example, your crankshaft position sensor, if it's a Hall effect, might require a 12-volt signal. But the TPS, which is a voltage divider with a potentiometer, is going to be a 5-volt reference. You need to have all of your ducks in a row, so to speak, when you go to wire your engine, because things that are a shared 12-volt can be spliced together on common rails with shared fuses within reason. For example, you might want a single fuse for your ignition coils and its own dedicated 12-volt supply, maybe also with your injectors. But all of your other things like your idle control valve or your Hall effect sensors or other things that use a 12-volt signal might share their own fuse as well. Similarly, you need to be mindful of your ground situation. Not everything uses a common ground. Certain things actually have specific sensor grounds that are a reference ground that the ECU monitors. So if there's any variance between that ground and the ground that it's going back to the battery, it's able to adjust for it and offset, because while it might seem like 0.0 something of a volt doesn't matter much to your ECU and its sensors, it can. It can be a significant error. So you have sensor grounds that will all need to be tied together, but then also very intentionally not grounded at other places, but only ground at the ECU for the ECU to monitor those ground voltages. Other grounds you'll want to have laid out and thought through and tied together. For example, there's no reason not to ground all of your ignition coils together, but you don't want to run a individual ground wire for each of those back to the battery or back to a ground at the ECU. Grounding is complicated. You can get by relatively easily with grounds that are good enough. And if you have a good chassis ground and a good engine ground and a good battery ground, you can get away with a lot of you can get away with a lot of bad grounding strategies. That being said, it does help to do a little bit of due diligence with your ECU and find out what your ECU manufacturer recommends for grounding and to follow that accordingly. But I'm getting off topic. This video and episode is really about doing the homework. I think I've covered just about everything that I had to research for this aspect of the build. The one thing I will say is that it is very handy to have some kind of computer in your shop or garage with you. More importantly, and part of that aspect is having the documentation for your ECU and your car on hand. Now, you could print those up on hard copy. If you could print them up on paper and have all those reference documents with you. I also highly advise you to have your kind of finished wiring harness documented in some way. even if that is just drawing it on a piece of paper and then later just taking a picture of it. But having a reference document for you to go back to know how you've got everything hooked up, that you haven't missed anything, that you got every wire accounted for, is super helpful. So all said, I think I have probably, I don't want to think about it too much, but probably well over 5 hours worth of homework of just wiring for this project. Now, wiring the engine might only take me another 5 to 10 hours. So 5 hours of homework seems like a lot, but that 5 hours of homework is also saving me time in the garage as well. So don't be afraid of having to do a little bit of homework. Don't be afraid of having to prep for your time in the garage. And also don't be afraid to do this however you want it to look. If you want to do this in your man cave off hours, then so be it. If you want to do it during lunch breaks at work, then that's fine too. Don't let how other people do the homework define how you feel you need to do the homework. Just make sure that you don't overlook the homework and then get discouraged when you realize that there's a lot more knowledge left before you can do the next thing on your project. And with that, keep jamming.